Remembering Neil Peart by Lesley Choyce. I last heard from Neil on my birthday, March 21st, 2019. Yeah, he was one of those folks who actually has the forethought to log your birthday into his Outlook calendar, then send you a nice personalized email to congratulate you on your milestone of progress through life. I'd known about his illness for a few years, but he had continually tried to make it sound a tad less ruinous than it really was. But now he was writing me to say, news from this end is grim, along with a note about being grateful about not being in pain. News of his death caught up with me a few days after he died on January 7th of that year. I was eating dinner and listening to the CBC News. We all learn about a friend's death in different ways. Usually a phone call, text message, or an email, and so this was the first time that it came to me on the national news. But then Neil was a celebrity, right? A legend, the drummer's drummer, and some said he was possibly among the best or even the best in the world. I didn't know him as a drummer, and I wasn't really even a Rush fan, although I later grew to appreciate much about their music. In fact, though, way back in the 1990s, when he first contacted me, I had no idea who he was. But soon we established an unusual and somewhat long-lasting type of friendship that I believe is quite rare these days. By rare, I mean it was the kind of literary relationship that British writers had with each other in the 18th and 19th century. And that was probably part of what made it work. Words were important to both of us. Written words. Neil, of course, wrote the lyrics to the Rush songs, and I was constantly scribbling away at fiction or poetry or some damn thing that might keep me relatively sane. Started out with a fan letter of sorts from Neil to me concerning my novel called The Republic of Nothing. God knows how he came across it, but he wrote me a cleanly typed 2-pager telling me that it connected with him and that he thought I should know. I think he introduced himself as some guy who played in a rock trio or rock combo, something like that. That he was primarily the guy who banged on things with sticks. It eventually clicked. The drummer behind Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson. I remembered some old publicity photos of 3 long-haired guys in turtlenecks, and they played those loud, high-powered rock anthems that made for great soundtracks for driving cross-country. I wrote back to Neil, of course, back then, and keep in mind, I'm talking about letters that you mail in the corner postbox. Sure enough, he wrote back again, this time telling me he had himself written a manuscript about riding a bicycle around Cameroon. Sure, I said, send it along. And he did, and it was damn good. That's when I confessed to him that I ran a small, and I do mean small, publishing company for local writers here in distant, foggy Nova Scotia. And by the way, Neil, why don't I publish this tale of biking, sweating, culture shock, exhaustion, and diarrhea through Pottersfield Press? Neil said he'd shown the manuscript around Toronto and been told to stick with his day job of banging on things with sticks. But if I wanted to take a publisher crack at it, sure, he said, go ahead for it. Do it, just do it. Sure, he said, go for it. So I did. Thus, in 1996, Pottersfield published The Masked Rider, and lo and behold, I discovered that Rush and Neil, in particular, had a legion of followers. Rush went on to tour not long after that, and so did the book. We sold scads of copies in Portland, Oregon, and Austin, Texas, and Cincinnati, Ohio, to name a few places where the band performed. The hard part for me was keeping up with the reprinting. Thousands of copies were sold, and soon after, Neil was on to writing his second book. That summer, a teenage boy from Michigan showed up with his parents in my driveway, wanting to know if this was where Neil Peart's book had been published. When I said yes, he waved for his parents to join him. They wanted photos of me in my house, and his mom said, we drove here from Michigan for this. I'm sure there must have been other reasons to drive this far, but that was the story. I met up with Neil in person for the first time at his home in Toronto, where I was introduced to his wife, Jackie, and their teenage daughter, Selena. We talked about books, family, and what it's like to be in our 40s. Yikes, how could we both be so bloody old? Neil was born in 1952, I was born in 1951. He might have told me a story or two about his own drumming mentors, old percussionists of the jazz persuasion, but there was no rock star talk, as I recall. And when he said, "I want you to listen to some music," he put on an old LP of Barry White. Go figure. I think, in truth, we were both kind of quiet, shy, intellectual types who ran out of things to talk about as the evening wore on. But our literary friendship continued just fine. Now we had moved up in the technological world to sending faxes to each other. I had a pet blue jay at the time who loved to hear the fax machine chime and would help tug the paper out as Neil's epistles from Ontario came in. And always they were not just letters, they were fine literary documents. My first Rush concert was in Vancouver, where I initially tracked Neil down at his hotel. "I'm checked in as Fred Flintstone," he told me. I found it hard to believe that he used an alias, and a silly one at that, to avoid hardcore fans who might be stalking him at his hotel, but there it was. At the front desk, I asked the young man to tell Fred Flintstone that Lesley Choyce was here. He did, and shortly thereafter told me, "Mr. Flintstone will be right down." And so I had a chance to hang out for the afternoon sound check, which, as you might know, is really a fairly tedious and mundane technical affair, in this case involving the monster iconic drum set, guitar tuning, keyboard sound levels, and checking the proper functioning of the several on-stage signature clothes dryers. The concert was a blast, of course, with a fully packed arena and Rush fans going wild at Tom Sawyer and New World Band, Subdivisions, among others. At intermission, I checked out the book sales, and when I told a Rush fan my relation to Neil, he wanted my autograph. It was a weird world indeed. I had plans for publishing Neil's second book, but I think the success of the first one and some urging from his upper echelon friends in Toronto encouraged him to find a bigger publisher. He had already lined up a New York literary agent, and pretty soon, Neil and I had some professional disagreements as to how his second book should be published. Soon after, while I was sitting in an internet cafe in the west of Ireland, we corresponded by email now, he told me he was going to go with a larger publisher. I was more than a little pissed off. There was a flurry of nasty correspondence, semi-professional, personal, vindictive. My daughter, Sunyata, got wind of the falling out and, without my knowing, faxed Neil from my office a scathing letter. Neil responded to me about how my whole family was against him. It looked like business might be the end of the friendship. I don't know who flinched first or whether it was through fax, phone, or email, but after a relatively short bout of "you said, no, you said," we both decided to put it behind us. Business is business and friendship is friendship. And thus, we remained long-distance friends for the rest of Neil's life. In the years following, Neil even donated several $1,000s a year to my daughter's nonprofit organization, Project Colors International, for charitable work in South Africa and the Dominican Republic. He was a guy who didn't hold a grudge. In 1997, tragedy struck in Neil's life. His daughter, Selena, 19 at the time, died in a car crash in Ontario. His wife, Jackie, died of cancer within the year. Neil and I were still corresponding on a regular basis with the occasional phone call, and I offered what little I could as a friend for consolation. Neil spent considerable time holed up in his cabin in the Laurentians, and I probably should have gone to visit him, but I didn't. His daughter had been close in age to my own daughter, and in truth, I could literally feel his pain. The darkness in his letters was as articulate as it was frightening. I'm sure I wasn't the only one in the world that worried he'd do something desperate, and when he told me his neighbor had lent him a gun for shooting a troublesome squirrel or two, I called to see how he was doing, and it was not good. But he carried on, and still grieving and looking for some way to relieve the pain, forget the tragedy, or just get distracted, he decided to get on his motorcycle and go on a solo continental journey of escape. He traveled from Quebec to British Columbia and south as far as Belize, and then north and east, all the while staying in correspondence with his close friend Brutus and a chosen other few, including, strangely, me. And then, as planned, one day he showed up at my door at Lawrencetown Beach, Nova Scotia, for a layover before heading back on the lonely road. Although I always knew that he and I were living in very different worlds, I felt a kinship that often prompted me to call him brother, in a way we used to do back in the hippie days. But it was a kind of brotherhood, a real brotherhood for sure. We talked long into the night, and he hinted that he believed the road was doing its best medicine possible. Nothing miraculous, just something. Purpose, maybe? You have to get up in the morning, pack up the saddlebags, and just go. Don't stop. When Neil visited, he slept that night in an old camper trailer I had in the backyard. In the morning said, at least now I'm proper trailer trash, leading me to have another glimmer of hope that the legendary drummer, now without sticks or drums, still had a sense of humor. There was a book from the journey, Ghost Rider, Travels on the Healing Road, and it was a powerful document of survival and recovery. It included some of our correspondence, for which I'm most grateful, and it stands as a memorable document of how the ultimate tragedy of one man can be wrestled back into a meaningful existence. The end of the cycle journey was California, and he did find a new love in his life, Carrie, and a new life altogether, along with the birth of a daughter, Olivia, born the same year as my first grandchild, Aiden. We swapped photos of babies and continued to write to each other about our lives and resurrected dreams. And somehow Neil found his way back to music. I didn't see Neil again until he set foot back in Nova Scotia in 2013. Rush was back on the road, and the CBC noted, Rush fans have waited more than a quarter of a century for the iconic Canadian band to return to Halifax, and now the wait is almost over. Sitting 3 rows back from the stage, I was blown away as any teenage rock fan could be. The word legendary, which I had so often scoffed at, suddenly seemed most appropriate. Neil graciously invited me and my wife Linda to join him in a small group of his traveling companions at the ritzy, secluded Trout Point Lodge. He was still biking it from venue to venue on his tour, and we met up with him there in the woods to catch up around an evening fire with lobster, oysters, wine, and some other guests who soon realized the guy tossing them a beer was someone they'd seen in music videos. It was in March of 2017, my birthday message again, when Neil told me about the brain cancer and asked that I didn't mention it to others. He did a fairly good job of keeping it quiet for the ensuing few years. I think I understand that it's better to hunker down with close family rather than milk sympathy from fans far and wide. The emails grew shorter, the jokes fewer, the prognosis grimmer. But he stayed in touch, and there was not a hint of wallowing in his prose. The Neil Peart I will remember is the modest, soft-spoken, literate, and loyal friend whose lyrical and musical craft had taken him to the top, but whose feet were mostly solidly planted on the ground. And then the news hit me that Friday at dinner time, after a day of teaching, after some afternoon preaching about how writing shapes a life. And I'll always remember Neil as a writer, a lover of words and literature, a craftsman of lyric, and, as the masked writer revealed, a modern-day Dante, who in midlife found himself on a descent into hell and mustered the will, the courage, and the wisdom to find his way back into the sunlight of everyday life.